mean, mate, I've seen people on Instagram lift in ways, and I look and I go, how the fuck have you still got any, like, your facet joints still functioning and remaining in your back? Like, what is going on?
Yeah.
Like, how can you lift like that? And I started a new hobby recently.
Okay.
I pick like leaves and heat them up. It's my new specialty.
Oh God, you've been spending too much time with Mike. Oh,
I love it. Right, let's actually do podcasting.
let's actually do podcasting. Hello and welcome to the Performance Proposition.
That one.
That one. Hello.
Well, what's the subject this week?
Today's Performance Proposition is that lifting with a rounded spine is always safe. And Matt lost the coin toss last week, which means that he gets to defend the proposition. And he says he's come ready. So
I have come ready. Should we start with a overview of why it matters?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You want to start off?
Obviously, talking about lifting, talking about doing anything in the gym and sport and things like that, we're always gonna have the topic of technique come up and being efficient, reducing injury, because we know that probably the biggest predictor of success in athletic pursuits is actually time spent healthy, right? Time not injured. So anything that we can do to reduce the risk of injury in the gym, on the field, doing wherever we're competing, wherever the sport exists, if we can reduce the time spent injured, we can increase time spent doing the sport, doing the thing, lifting in the weight room, doing all that sort of stuff. Right? That's the overarching reason this debate matters today.
And the main argument seems to be within the world of fitness historically, lifting with a rounded back increases the risk of injury, and as a result will reduce the amount of time that you can spend training and the amount of time you spend healthy. And there are plenty of reasons for that argument that have been given, and it's led to just that being the foundation on which a lot of people build their training programs, but also a lot of fear of movement within the industry as well. So a lot of people that are afraid of ever moving outside of optimal form.
Yeah. I mean, I'm sure you've had clients as well who are like, oh, I don't feel like I can go up because I kind of rounded my back a little bit on that last rep and things like that.
I've got clients that will look around the gym and will see someone lifting with a rounded back and they'll be like, oh my God, should someone not go over and stop that person? So that's another one. Like you see quite a lot. The reason why people kind of refer to the increased risk of injury kind of comes down to the mechanics of it. Do we want to go into the mechanics of it today? Do you want to like start with a little bit of a foundational understanding of that, or?
Yeah, why not? You know, the more we won't get super technical with it, but just, you know, a general idea of why it might be unsafe to lift with a rounded back would probably be a good segue, just so people can understand, you know, where it's coming from. Do you want to do that?
Cool. So when it comes to lifting with a rounded back, you are going to expose the posterior side of your spine to increased shearing forces. There's going to be an increased risk of herniation, supposedly, through that posterior side as front of the disc becomes compressed and places pressure on the connective tissue around the back of the disc that can then lead to an increased risk of injury. The other thing that is probably a little bit more accurate as a mechanism for why you might see an increased risk of injury with a rounded spine is the whole idea of your spine's designed to rotate. Each vertebra can rotate well when it's in a neutral spine position. But the second that you round your spine, obviously you will minimize the amount of rotation. You can kind of see that because if you stand or you sit with a neutral spine, you try to twist, you'll see you get quite a lot of rotation. Yeah. Whereas the second that I curve my spine, my ability to twist gets substantially reduced. So understanding you're going to see less rotation because less of those vertebrae can actually rotate means that any rotational force is going to be handled by a smaller percentage of overall vertebra, which means that more of that rotational force is going to be placed on those that can rotate, and that might overload the musculature designed to prevent that.
Yeah. And so, I mean, when we're talking about injuries from potentially injuries from rounded backs, are we just talking spine, or are we also talking like muscles?
We could talk musculature as well. So there's the idea that being in a rounded back position places more strain on the musculature of the posterior chain. And that's kind of a little bit of a complicated area because, as we were saying just before this, basically, if you're in a rounded back position, you actually shorten your spine, which means that the external load is going to be applied to a shortened lever, which means that actually the overall load being overcome by the muscles of the back is smaller. But because of the length tension relationship of how muscles contract, by being in that lengthened position, you're actually reducing the number of cross bridges that can be created, which is reducing the overall force that can be created by those muscles. Yeah. So the level of strain actually comes down to the ratio between the amount of force that can be created versus the amount of load that you're being exposed to. So if the overall load's being reduced by 20%, your capacity to produce force from that position is being reduced by 40%, then the overall strain on that muscle is going to be greater. And then the other side of it comes down to the concentric nature of the movement as well. So if you are holding a position, if you're braced and your back's static the whole way through a lift, then the amount of force required to produce that isometric contraction is lower than the amount of force that would be required to accelerate the movement through a concentric phase. So that's that to contend with as well. Yeah. And when that concentric phase happens within the lift also changes the amount of force that's required, because if you're at the bottom end of the movement when load is maximal on a deadlift, and you try to perform the concentric action at that point, it's very different to if you're very close to the top end of the movement, and therefore the moment arm is going to be reduced by the degree to which you've extended your spine already. That final phase where you're trying to concentrically extend your spine is going to require less force than it would have done if you were fully down. So it's it's a really complicated and a little bit of a dry area, but it's worth kind of understanding.
Yeah, and I guess I think one thing that people don't necessarily talk about as much when they talk about lifting with a rounded back is the areas that by proxy are in either more or less advantageous position if your spine is rounded, right? Because once you round one part of your spine, everything moves, right? So usually if you're in a rounded back position, you're also in a posteriorly tilted pelvis, anteriorly tilted pelvis, posteriorly tilted pelvis. Yeah. In which case your hamstrings are going to be lengthened to a greater degree than they would be if it was lengthened or shortened.
Shortened. So
yeah. So it's possible that your hamstrings are actually in a more advantageous position to produce force in a rounded back position. Whereas the shoulders at the top, if you're rounded forward, they're going to be in a less advantageous position to produce force, because as that's pulled forward, maybe the scap rotates forward as well and puts pressure on muscles of the rotator cuff, which we know are very small and very incapable of dealing with force. So, there's that little added element of like, your spine is not just your spine. Your hip bone is connected to your backbone, and your backbone is connected to your arm bone. Do you know what I mean? So, like, when we're talking about this stuff, I think it's also worth just kind of expanding the view a little bit and being, because the classic round back position that everyone will immediately go to is a deadlift.
The other thing that's worth thinking about as well is like the line of pull. So, is the force coming from below? So, is it like an inferior superior load? Is it anterior posterior? Where's that force coming from? And how's that acting on the spine? Depending on where that force is coming from is going to change the degree to which you're placing strain on the muscular system, or you're placing strain on the joint system. If the weight's coming from below you, like on a deadlift, then it's going to lead to much more compression in a bent back position. Whereas if the weight's coming from in front of you, it's going to put a lot more strain on the muscular tissue. So it's kind of like understanding all of that. What's happening if you're dealing with a force that's actually acting laterally or through rotation, how that impacts injury risk is quite an important thing to note as well. So
100%. So, with all that considered, is it safe to lift with a rounded back?
So you've got to say yes, and I've got to challenge you. And I've got like three kind of areas that I think are important to talk about and consider. So the first one comes down to the frequency with which you're rounding your back. The second comes down to why your back's rounding. And then the final one is going to come down to who the individual is. So when it comes to frequency, like if you look at studies online, like the main ones that you're going to find about increased injury risk with rounded backs kind of come down to there's like a lot of studies into kind of disc herniations with rounded spines, and the idea that actually it's not just going to be a one-off event that leads to a risk of herniation. It's a cumulative effect and build-up of repeated flexion and extension through your spine that damages that connective tissue, and in so doing, increases the risk of herniation. So what are your thoughts on that? Because obviously if you're going to coach someone and you're going to say it's absolutely fine for them to round their spine, what you're actually saying is it's fine for you to repeatedly expose your spine.
The key point in what you just said is repeated flexion extension of the spine.
Yeah.
Right. So whether or not that occurs during a movement is obviously a big thing, because you can deadlift with a rounded back or a slightly rounded back, and at no point in the movement extend that spine under load, right?
Yeah.
Like you can extend the hips and keep the spine where it starts and then come back down, and you can.
But even in doing that, at some point that person is going to come back into a neutral position. So regardless of whether or not it happens during the course of the lift, there's still going to be a point in that where they have to return to extension.
Yeah, but then we're sat here, I can.
Yeah, you can flex and extend,
but
the point within those studies is that actually repeatedly
under load.
Not necessarily repeatedly under load. The magnitude of the load increased the magnitude of the risk, or the magnitude of the injury, but not necessarily the level of risk of injury. So repeatedly performing the movement was enough in its own right to lead to deviations and lead to issues around potential herniations. The magnitude of the load would mean that you would have a bigger herniation if it was under that load when the herniation occurred.
From that point, I guess the big question to say is, like, when we talk about lifting with a rounded back, are we suggesting that the back stays rounded through the whole thing, or are we suggesting that there's flexion extension? Right. So like a Jefferson curl, different, massively different to like a deadlift. Right, because like I said, a deadlift at the top, you can stay rounded.
So would you say that a Jefferson curl is more dangerous than a rounded back deadlift?
I mean, no, because my point is that it's the other way around.
Okay, but the point you just made then, the argument you're making is in favour of the idea.
But, and we know this because we talked about it the other week, connective tissue can adapt.
Yes.
And placing something under stress doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to get injured, provided you manage the load and keep it within an area that it can recover and adapt to the stimulus.
But I kind of saw this argument was never really going to go. I just thought it was an important.
No, I think it's good.
Kind of I think actually the main point that we can make off the back of that is, okay, if you constantly expose yourself to flexion extension without ever giving yourself any time to recover and adapt to that flexion extension, then obviously you're going to increase the risk of injury. But actually, if you manage the load effectively and you program things effectively and plan when you're going to incorporate movements that involve moving with a flexed or extended spine, you're going to be able to mitigate the risks.
I think that's a really important point to make, because whenever we're hearing the debates on either side of the argument, right, it's always your side. Yeah. Like that side of the argument is always saying, hey, these studies say flex, extend, you're going to get injured. Yeah. The other guys say, hey, but I flex and extend my spine all the time and I don't get injured. Yeah. And the connection between the two, the actual thing that ties them together, the idea, the concept that it's possible for your connective tissue to adapt, never gets mentioned. It's always just like, you can't flex extend. You can flex extend. You can't do it. You can do it.
And if manage the load effectively, let your body adapt. If you never do it, then you're going to increase the risk even more, because of the fact you've never so your connective tissue is not ready for any degree of strain. Your muscular tissue is not ready for any degree of strain. So any movement that takes you outside of optimal is going to lead to an injury. Yeah. Whereas if you are kind of training with a rounded back on a regular basis, if you never give yourself the opportunity to recover and adapt, eventually it's going to lead to that cumulative effect and you are going to end up with an injury. So in that argument, we have basically just said that I win, because technically speaking, if you don't manage load effectively, then lifting with a rounded back is dangerous. But we'll ignore that for now, and we'll move on to the next. We'll move on to the next topic, because I don't want you to feel like you've lost already.
I'll be honest with you, mate. I knew I'd lost before we started.
Okay, fine.
Because the argument was so
absolute.
I was like, I just, all I can do here is just be really pedantic and pray that it doesn't come out. But that's the whole point of the podcast. The whole point of the podcast is
I mean, you do need to have that absolute, because at the end of the day, the way the fitness industry speaks online is always absolute. It's always in absolutes. And that's like, it's kind of part of the challenge. And if you can defend that point, then we can have a really interesting conversation about that point. The second argument that I made was kind of down to why the back's rounding. Okay, so often you'll see people talk about how it's completely safe to lift with a rounded back, so long as you're maintaining a
Position.
set position, right? So you've got yourself into a braced position and you've maintained that brace, you've maintained that position as you performed the lift, but you've actually developed the tension in the muscles that support your spine before you've started the movement. But quite often you'll see people lose tension at the start of the lift.
Almost instantly.
Like the second they start to push, and that comes down to the fact they didn't actually recruit the musculature properly before they started the lift. And as a result, their back's rounded.
Or they did recruit it, and the load exceeds the musculature's ability to deal.
Yeah, but normally if that kind of happened completely, if the load exceeded their ability to produce the force, then they wouldn't complete the lift. I'm talking about people that still manage to complete the lift in spite of the fact their backs. Because like if someone pulls and they don't manage to lift the bar and their back just rounds and they end up looking like a banana.
But it's possible to complete a lift even if like the back musculature is like, fuck, I can't deal with this. Because like you said about like, once you get past the knees, if you bend and you extend and you get the bar sort of past there, you can kind of like do the whole hitching thing, like get underneath it.
But I suppose in that scenario,
scoop it
at
up.
a certain point, the back musculature, the tension developed in the back has to be enough to overcome the load of the bar. Because if not, the bar won't ever. Because the back will just continue to bend and continue to bend and continue to bend.
I see.
So, like, yeah, okay, you can reduce, like, you might see that because of the fact the lever length reduces, all of a sudden the individual can overcome that load because of the fact they can create that level of force in their back. But even in that scenario, it's unlikely. I think the main thing that I want to get to is those people that, because they don't develop tension properly in their back, the second they start the lift, there's that deficit between the amount of tension required to overcome the load and the amount of tension that is being created in the back muscles and in the leg muscles. So what tends to happen then is you see the legs shoot up, then eventually, because of the fact it takes time to achieve peak tension in your muscle, the tension created by their back musculature does become enough to exceed the load of the bar. And then they lift with a rounded back. But in that entire period, they're having to then deal with the fact their back's rounded. They've exposed themselves to more load than they were prepared for. And then they're trying to extend their back against that load. And that, in that scenario, I think is probably a little bit risky if you weren't planning for that. If you are trying to max out your lift.
But then I would say, to your point, that if they're managing to finish the lift, their back musculature is clearly still doing its job of protecting the spine because it's still producing enough force to stop the shear forces of the bar. I'm trying really hard here.
I know. I appreciate that. I think that so the argument you made is reasonable. Like, yeah, okay, the back muscular does eventually get to a point where it's able to deal with that load, and the back muscular was strong enough to
stop it going back down and
produce
therefore fully
that
snapping
force.
the spine.
But there is that period at that start point where there's that eccentric phase, which is created by the fact that the external load is greater than the internal tension. So the external force is greater than the internal force. And in that situation, in that scenario, there is a period where until that internal tension is enough to exceed the external load, you're under increased risk. So that's kind of like the second argument. And then the third argument comes down to who, which is if you're dealing with someone who is a relatively strong person who has trained, who's got the training experience, who's exposed themselves to load for long enough that they can then know how much weight they can put on a bar safely and do rounded back exercises and go through an extent like a back extension movement. So whether that's like a Zercher deadlift or a Jefferson curl or what have you, that's absolutely fine. But then if you've got someone who is a complete newbie who hasn't got that level of training experience and isn't ready for that load, that's going to be relatively high risk. But more importantly, if you've got someone who's got an injury that's exacerbated by flexion, then that individual just shouldn't be exposed to that, especially when it's still causing exacerbation of the injury. There are at a certain point, you're probably going to want to try and build up the amount or the degree to which they can be exposed to, and that can be done through.
Well, it's all load management.
It's all load management. Which basically, does that mean that we've just agreed with Harry and Sam's post from 3 weeks ago, where it was just cool. Well, I'm glad we put all this prep into it. Really, when it was we could have just sent people towards a 3-minute long video.
It would have been easier. But yeah, I mean, I agree with you on like, it depends on the person, but I also think it comes back to the oldest possible concept in sports science / strength and conditioning, which is Milo and the Bull.
Yeah.
And progressive overload. Because I mean, mate, I've seen people on Instagram lift in ways, and I look and I go, how the fuck have you still got any, like, your facet joints still functioning and remaining in your back? Like, what is going on?
Yeah.
Like, how can you lift like that and not be broken? And the only conclusion I can come to in my mind is that's the way they've always lifted. And they've started at the same point that everyone else started at,
Yeah.
lightweights, and they've just started lifting like that. And their connective tissue, everything has adapted to be in that position.
Yeah.
If you put me in that position, I'd probably be fucked.
You've got the strongest spine I know.
No, but me in that position with the same relative one I
Yeah,
am.
yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Like I don't even want to think about what would happen if I put like 180, 190 on a squat and I squatted it like this. Like, I would die. I'm pretty sure I'd die.
It's a sad way to go as well.
It would be a sad way to go. But the guy that I've seen on Instagram, he squats like that at a 1RM because that's his 1RM. And like, guaranteed, if he squatted with a slightly more mechanically efficient position, he'd probably lift more. But for the way that he wants to lift, it's safe and it's effective. And he, can keep putting weight on it. He will just be slightly behind his potential, in my opinion. And that's it. So it's not like safe or not safe. It's just kind of like, yeah, you're fine. It's not optimal, but you're fine.
Yeah.
That's the point I always come back to with round back stuff.
I always think it's interesting from a weightlifting versus movement perspective when it comes to the argument about optimal versus suboptimal lifting. I don't want to get too much into it because you said that's going to be the next topic of conversation. But it's like, just because something isn't necessarily going to encourage optimal movement in a on-field movement, so it's not going to encourage your like optimal development of your quadriceps and hamstrings, squatting with a rounded back, doesn't necessarily mean that it couldn't lead to you producing more like if you look at some of the strongest like deadlifters in history, like they've lifted with like a frog stance deadlift, which wouldn't necessarily be seen as the optimal lifting strategy, and does tend to lead to them having a slightly rounded spine in the top in the bottom position. But the amount of load that they can lift in that position is actually massive, and it puts you in a pretty strong position for that. So yeah, so basically, summary wise, we're saying that it's absolutely fine to lift with a rounded back so long as you're not a prick.
I mean, yeah, it all comes down to like managing your intensity. Like, what is my body able to deal with in this movement? Have I prepared myself to cope with the positions I'm putting myself in? Because that's, and
working to the weakest link.
Yeah.
As well, yeah.
Just to rehash again, like one of the arguments that's used a lot by people who, are on that round back, like, side of it. It's like, unless you expose your body to load in positions in which it is weak, when you find yourself in those positions that you're weak randomly, you also increase your risk of injury. So staying completely away from any spinal flexion. And it's the same with spinal extension, mate. No one talks about spine extension. No. Everyone talks about spine flexion because it's the one that you see. But it's equally important to train full extension, not neutral, in arch back, rather than question mark. Bracket. We want to train that. We want to train full hip internal rotation. We want to train like full like hip abduction.
Training in compromised positions is just an important thing. Any training in compromised positions is going to make you more robust. Any training in optimal positions is going to make you stronger. So if you really want to push up like the intensity of your lift, try and train in a position that is in the position that's safest to do so. If you want to train to make sure that you can apply that force in multiple different situations, play around with like
and it's not even the safest. Like you said, like there's not necessarily like a safe position to do it, because it, in my mind, like if you want to lift with a rounded back and deadlift, you just have to lift less than you would lift with a
when I was saying about doing safe, I was talking about like if you are trying to push up the intensity, if you're trying to lift the heaviest weight you possibly can, lift in a way that is going to expose you to the least risk of injury with
the most amount of force.
So like it comes down to the conversation we were having the other day about the difference between a hex bar deadlift and a conventional deadlift for rugby players. The number of people that are going around from the anti-fragile movement that are saying, oh well, why is a hex bar better? Why is a trap bar better for deadlift? It's not actually safer. And it's like, it's not safer when you're working at the same RPE, But if you're trying to expose yourself to a certain amount of load in the right position that matches your needs for your sport, then the trap bar deadlift is probably going to be the better option for you.
But equally on that, to your point earlier about like the volume of stuff and our point about giving connective tissue time to recover and adapt.
Yeah.
If you're a rugby player and you lift with a rounded back and you put your connective tissue under pressure and then you fucking go and scrum that puts your connective tissue under pressure. Did you watch the Rugby World Cup final?
Yep.
Yeah. You saw what Steph Toy looked like after that World Cup final. It looked like he'd gone 7 rounds with Rocky, right? Like, imagine putting yourself through what that man put himself through.
Yeah.
On a week by week basis with a spine that is already like, okay, I've got to recover from these rounded back deadlifts because it's put slightly more pressure on than if I'd lifted neutrally or if I lifted with my hex bar, which allows me to stay and just focus on these bad boys that it doesn't give me any stuff to recover from my spine. And then I'm going to go out and I'm going to hit 100 kilo blokes with like the forces of 2 cars colliding.
But then equally, lifting with a rounded back during his off season,
it's probably
put him in a position where he's going to be more robust and he's going to be better able to deal with that when it comes to the in-season.
But he's not going to be stupid enough to do that.
Man, rugby players get hit in the head a lot. Rugby players, no one come for me. I'm a weak, skinny man.
Yeah, I mean, I always work to like when I've been when I've been in the elite environments I go to, I'm like, what do most people do? Like, I've never been in a rugby environment where they've gone, we're going to conventionally deadlift. We're going to do conventional deadlift. It just doesn't happen because they used to, and then they went, oh shit, these really tall guys who don't have great mobility because they spend most of their time like wrestling with other blokes on fields.
Yeah,
maybe we should put them in a really non-mobility dependent movement that allows them to get strong safely. Like you've seen LeBron James squat.
But it's the same as the difference between like teaching someone to high pull versus teaching someone to clean, right?
Yeah.
Like what's going to give you the most bang for your buck as an exercise? And like maybe if you've got someone who's like interested in Olympic lifting, teaching them how to clean is going to be a really useful thing because they're just going to enjoy it and they're going to embrace it and they're going to work with that journey. But the people that don't necessarily have the time to put in the hours to develop perfect clean form and instead just want to learn how to power clean 130 like Tom Morgan. You saw that the other day. Matt was really upset because we were in the gym and he said that Tom wasn't allowed to power clean 130 before he cleaned 130 and then Tom just...
Hey. I've cleaned 130. I said he wasn't allowed to do it while I was in the gym.
Oh. Okay. All right. I'm glad to... Well, technically speaking...
I've cleaned 131.
You weren't in the gym when he did it. So
okay, there you go.
Yeah,
there you go. It was fine.
Yeah,
it worked out.
It didn't actually happen.
It worked out.
I actually counted the weights and it's... Yeah.
So basically, to summarize, it's completely fine to lift with a rounded back.
Just do it
provided
when it's at, like, understand why you're doing it, understand the purpose, and work to the weakest link in that movement pattern.
And if the purpose of your lift is to lift the most weight that you want, or to do it with with good technique, which is usually the way to lift the most weight, then entering a rounded back position means that you haven't achieved what you've set out to do and is therefore suboptimal, and you probably shouldn't be doing it. And you should probably need to manage your load. Manage the weight on the bar.
Select an appropriate intensity in that scenario.
And that is as simple as that. It's just, if your intention is not to lift with a rounded back, then you shouldn't have a rounded back. If your intention is to lift with a rounded back and you're doing it for a purpose, crack on.
Good debate.
So
next week, we've said that the topic is going to be, that the proposition is...
Lifting with good technique
is the most important thing.
Lifting with good technique is the best way to progress in the gym. I think that's a good one. Or the best way to progress athletically.
Ooh, yeah, okay. I mean, that's actually a defendable point. Yeah. So lifting with optimal technique is the best way to develop athletically. I like that.
Cool,
right.
Cool.
Where's that £2
I'm going to lose the toss now, aren't I? 100% I am. I know it. I can feel it.
You are the coin flipper. So here you go, sir.
I mean, I feel like you feel like I have more control over this than I do.
Heads I get to defend.
Check it as heads.
Nice. All right, cool. I actually get to defend. Wicked. I mean, it's a good one to, based on the conversation we just had, it's actually an easy enough one to attack as well, but it's an
easy enough one to attack, but it's another one where
You would have liked. You would have liked to.
I would have loved it. But this is the point. Challenge the misconceptions. Challenge your own
The one thing we
biases.
haven't spoken about today was so before we started the chat, you said that you had your mindset shifted a little bit on this topic. So what was the kind of main thing that you read that changed the way? What were your thoughts before you started reading? How did they change? And what was the main thing you read that led to that change in the way you felt?
Well, my thoughts before I started lifting were it was sort of down the line of what we just discussed, i.e., like, just don't be a dick with your load, and like obviously it's safe because I've lifted with a roundabout before and I haven't blown my spine out. But it was kind of like well, obviously it's unsafe in certain circumstances and things like that. And then just the more I read into it, and like you said about, like, I mentioned to you the study where it was like you actually get more activation and more help from your spinal extensors if your back is rounded. And I was like, oh snap, actually it makes sense.
When we go back to that hypertrophy conversation, that makes sense as well, right? Because training in a lengthened position leads to increased rate of hypertrophy development, which is going to make you
Exactly. And then, I was reflecting on like the points from the other week, hence why I brought it up about the connective tissue adaptation, things like that. Because, well, I mean, like I say, my point before was very much down that line of, but repeated flexion extension over a prolonged period of time is just what is going to result in it unless you sort it out, sort of thing. And it just kind of, it didn't so much as change it, but it kind of, I think, it's very easy sometimes to get stuck in your way of thinking that you've always held. Because, that a lot of my early engagement with the side of the debate came on the side of people like Squat U and other things. And like a lot of the guys I worked with, like early doors in the fitness industry, were very much down there. You got to move like this. You got to move like that. You got to move like this. You got to move like that. And so like that was just my sort of, I guess, internal biases, like blind biases.
I think the way that you like to train as well, like not necessarily like the kind of insane EMOM things that you do at the moment, but like coming from a background in Olympic lifting, like being an Olympic lifter requires you to be able to go through certain key points in a movement, and you have to hit certain positions. And if you don't hit those positions, the chances are you're going to fail the lift. You do just end up thinking, okay, right, how do I minimize energy lift? How do I minimize energy leaks? How do I get myself into that position as quickly and as smoothly as I can? And then it does come down to like, okay, well, everything just has to be rehearsed. Everything has to be practiced. Everything has to be perfect in terms of my technique, so that I can maximize the amount of weight I lift. Weightlifters have no right to lift the amount of weight that they actually do lift, but because they move so efficiently and they move so well, then
100%. So like it's less of like I've changed my mind. It's more like I've taken a step back and really re-looked at like what I'm saying and how I'm thinking about things, and kind of gone, I'm probably being a little bit pig-headed and a little bit like I say, just it's blind bias. It's like bias that you wouldn't realize that you had until you took a step back and you really looked at it. And like, I guarantee you there's loads of people on both sides of the debate, if they actually just stepped back for a second and went, I've based my whole identity on saying this thing. And in reality, I don't actually believe it, like as fully as I say that I believe it, but I've just never taken that step back. And I think that's all it is.
I just think it's such a massive issue in terms of presentation as well, though, right? And such a massive issue in terms of what gets you clout on social media, what has an impact on social media, and being controversial and saying something simple that people can latch onto and then can become part of your tribe because they believe what you believe.
Should we just start like a moderate tribe?
I feel like I feel like there is just such a massive gap in the middle ground of like everything, literally every single domain of life is just lacking a middle ground
gap.
Like it's infuriating, but it comes down to like how we consume information. It comes down to like how we as an audience want that information to be delivered to us. And regardless of what we say we want, if we continue to like spend our time watching shit and just looking at like short snippets of information and being like, oh my God, look how great, like I've now learnt this thing in the last 10 seconds. Like we're just going to keep on having that sent to us, and social media brands are going to continue to build their algorithms around delivering that to us.
Here's an idea for you.
Okay, cool.
Right. We put posts out and we say like, unless you can add nuance to your point, you're a government psyop.
I mean, that would work. Done.
Like,
Done. I feel like I'll let you do that.
You're like, unless if you don't add nuance to your points, then you're just a pussy. Straight up.
Nice. Nice.
No nuance.
No
No
nuance.
nuance. Then like
I like it. I like delivering a message with no nuance to try and encourage nuance. That's